Hello, dear viewers. We are in my New York company. My name is Yuri Dashevsky for friends. And I usually have my podcasts, webcasts, YouTube streams in Russian. But this is a special occasion. We've done a number of streams with Irina Tsukerman, human rights advocate, and so this one is in English, and this one is on the subject that very few little know anything about. But it's important, and I had some information that entered my mm, neural system, my natural intelligence, however modest, about what's going on in the sphere of how would call information and warfare would be the most portmanteau on the subject. So, Irina, please tell us about the situation you have described to me in your correspondence.
Just to give a little bit of context, I've been investigating a group of digital rights organizations and their connections to various media for a few years now. And this past summer, I did an interview with a digital forensics expert based on his academic report explaining the methodology of an organization called Citizen Lab, which was allegedly uncovering Pegasus software's abuse against journalists, dissidents, and political opposition in various countries. Pegasus software is a very sophisticated, untraceable form of surveillance that was developed by an Israeli uh, company, NSO group, and it is classified as a weapon. And the company itself considers itself a registered arms dealer. It has a license to sell various types of weapons, ranging from drone technology to cyber surveillance, um, based on the regulatory mechanisms it has developed and which have been approved by the Israeli government. And it has a range of relationships with countries around the world. Citizen Lab, however, accused it of deliberately or negligently ignoring its own regulations and allowing state actors, who are the only ones allowed to purchase the Pegasus software, to utilize it indiscriminately against critics of those governments. This is what I was investigating, and when I found a digital forensics expert who wrote an academic report about it, I thought it was interesting. Unfortunately, this cost me my Twitter account because of the campaign from the information security community and journalists, blue check marks on Twitter, which happened as soon as I announced that this would be the subject of the interview. I did invite Citizen Lab and its partner organizations, Amnesty International and Access Now, to come on air, and I offered to give them equal time and opportunity to respond to any questions and criticisms and to provide their own perspective, but they refused to do that. Instead, they worked through their own channels to shut me down. I have not had my Twitter account restored since then. In fact, my account was impersonated by some troll accounts online, and Twitter got back to me eventually and accused me of being an impersonator, despite the fact that I was the one providing my passport information, and despite the fact that I've had an account since 2008, whereas this imitation account popped up in August 2022. Obviously, who is imitating whom? I nevertheless continued my investigation of social media through articles and interviews and postings on other types of social media. And eventually, while I was working on various issues seemingly unrelated to this, such as Russia's information warfare strategy and its geopolitical influence and relationships with different countries, um, a well-known journalist from Germany reached out to me by the name of Holger Stark, who works for a publication named Der Zeit. Der Zeit is part of a consortium of media which is charged with investigating these Pegasus allegations. And this group of media, internationally known, which includes German Der Zeit, France based Le Monde, and Forbidden Stories. I'll get to Forbidden Stories in a little bit. The Guardian, Washington Post, Haaretz, and many others. So they work together, and they essentially share information methods, and they all share in this perspective. In their entire reporting is based on information given to them by Citizen Lab, Amnesty International, and Access Now. None of these media have independent capacity to verify that information because none of them are digital forensics experts. They're journalists, they're writers, they're not technical experts, just to make it very clear. So whatever they share is based on their belief that those organizations have credibility, the skills, the know-how, and the good faith in providing accurate reporting, accurate data on this issue. And several people besides the expert Jonathan Scott interviewed since then raised questions about methodology used by Citizen Lab and its partners, and I've mentioned that in the past. Now, getting back to what is happening today. Forbidden, when I was interviewed by Holger Stark, he mentioned that he was part of a group of journalists, along with Forbidden Stories and others whom he did not specify, who are working on various investigations and articles regarding disinformation, digital influence campaigns, as well as um, harassment of journalists online. But with respect to me, when he reached out, his interest was specific to my work regarding Russia. It had nothing to do, he did not mention Citizen Lab, he did not mention my work, he did not mention anything related to that part of it. His work concerned Russia disinformation campaign and my professional activity listed online. Therefore, when he mentioned Forbidden Stories, I figured, okay, different journalists work with each other on different projects. He may very well be part of that particular investigation, but it's very clear to me that this interview is not about that. And indeed, we did not really talk about that subject. He brought up exactly what he said he would bring up. I mentioned his past articles that I've read that dealt with somewhat related subjects, and I'll get to that momentarily. And at the end of the interview, I offered him to provide any additional information to substantiate what I told him, and I told him that he can reach out to me if he has any follow-up questions. That interview was followed by an unexpected phone call from an unknown number, which turned out to be based in France, and it turned out to be Holger Stack's French colleague who works for Forbidden Stories. I expected that if anyone would be following up on that interview, it would be Stark himself. So I was surprised that Forbidden Stories was partnering with him because the interview did not seem to have anything at all to do with the subject of their interest. It had to do with what my methodology, not somebody else's. And I thought that I had satisfactorily responded to all the questions about that, but the Forbidden Stories interview was quite hostile, very aggressive. It accused me of violating FARA by appearing with human rights groups in congressional meetings, despite any paucity of evidence that I was in any way paid for that work or that I did anything to violate the law in those particular appearances. And it touched on the typical subjects that a hostile publication would try to dig up on somebody opposed to their work. But it was completely unrelated to the interview that I had with Holger Stack in terms of subject, despite the fact that she announced from the very beginning that they are working together. So I'm not sure what was the purpose of the initial interview, maybe to mislead me into getting involved in responding to that conglomerate, because the first interview was informative rather than aggressive. It was open-ended. It was not particularly hostile. I answered all the questions, and then I was also sent a written questionnaire. And another journalist from a different publication from the same conglomerate followed up to my professional contacts and also asked them questions about my professional relationship with a particular human rights NGO, a Yemeni NGO, and asked again questions about violations of FARA, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, that regulates the way American lobbyists present themselves, and when engaged in the lobbying activity, they have reporting requirements that they are required to provide information about to make their activities and transparent, and to provide financial disclosures. I, however, am not a lobbyist, and this does not apply to me at all. I'm an American human rights lawyer. I discuss humanitarian aid. I discuss U.S. security interests. I do not lobby for other foreign governments. For that reason, I was happy to answer the questions, although I was not pleased that this was a very clearly biased interview, and I figured that some of my comments would be taken out of context or twisted in a way that would misrepresent my meaning, so I was very careful in the way I responded to the question. Um, and while all of this was happening, Forbidden Stories broke the story about this whole Jorge situation, while also Amnesty and Forbidden Stories and other members of this conglomerate continued pushing allegations about Pegasus in various media. BBC just had a major story about it, and many others. All of it was happening at the same time. This week, Forbidden Story came out with an article which did not at all directly quote me. It merely summarized the points or how they interpreted what I said to them, but did not give me even a single quote. It did quote people who had previously attacked me and who had conflicts of interest in this issue and who were involved in all these situations. It could not actually prove that I did anything inappropriate, illegal, or unethical, but it very strongly implied that I did, or that my political views and positions are inappropriate, shameful, and so forth, but without any evidence or anything concrete that would really make any legal connection to all of that. Simultaneously to all of that happening, a group of Islamist accounts were harassing me with anti-Zionist, anti-Israel, anti-Semitic accusations, including the use of photos, some of which were hacked from one of my devices and disseminated online. And they rehashed similar points from in the past. All of that appeared to be coordinated with the same set of characters present in the Forbidden Story news article. And later on, one of these characters, who features both with the Islamist group of characters and with the InfoSec group of people, said that she would be writing a book about how she was allegedly harassed by various people, including me. All of that was coordinated. Now, let me explain who Forbidden Stories are, just so people would be aware. They're a new organization. They're based they started in 2017 or 2018. They're based in France, and they are funded by George Soros's Open Society or Open Democracy
Open
organization.
society.
Yes, and by Edward Snowden's startup, and they list that on their website. This is not anything.
Edward Snowden startup, meaning what? He's in Russia now, right?
He's in Russia, but he, with whatever money he has from whatever sources, presumably also Russian, started an organization related to digital activity in cybersecurity, and that organization provided money to Forbidden Stories. So he is one of the sources of funding for these organizations, just to be clear. And while all of this was happening, I interviewed an American investigative journalist, Edward J. Epstein, who in 2017 wrote a book about Snowden, not from the whistleblower perspective about his value in uncovering NSA's metadata gathering program, but from the perspective of US security and what damage his activities had on US security and other countries' security interests, intelligence, and so forth, which was very substantial but not nearly well understood or covered by most Americans thanks to the positions taken in the media. It's worth noting that Holger Stark did admit to me during the interview that he was one of the people who received um, some of the documents related to Snowden early on. So did the founder of Citizen Lab, Ron Dybert. Um, Stark had positions who were sympathetic to leakers and whistleblowers. He had written a book on WikiLeaks by Julian Assange. He had also had the work related to Chelsea Manning, Bradley Manning, the another leaker uh, who ended up being convicted of national security violations. So his views ideologically were also always very much in line with these people. And so if you are looking for the political explanation behind it, it's right there. They're not really hiding who they are, their political positions, or who is funding or who is behind these campaigns. With respect to Pegasus, it should be made very clear that Pegasus is competition to Russians and to various other entities and countries. Some people are against all surveillance, commercial surveillance software. Some people are specifically against Israeli surveillance software. Russians are specifically against that software because um, they cannot themselves obtain it, and because it is superior to whatever they have, and they have plenty. And they work hand in hand with other interests, such as Qatar, which also has failed to obtain that particular type of spyware. But Qatar itself is very well known for using various Western companies and even Israeli companies to hack their targets. So this is really about the fact that they don't have access to something that they really want, and if they can't have it, then no one else should either. There are American interests. There are companies that have invested money into American type of software, some of which is very harmful because it is being used by China. It is not regulated the way Pegasus is, and therefore it's sold to adversarial interests, or it is misused by domestic actors in a way that is also antithetical to individual rights of Americans. So there is this collusion of interests, each of which has reasons to not like Israeli software companies, and including NSO Group. Some of it is simple bigotry against Israel and anti-Semitic sentiments. They're working with Islamists. It's very obvious who they are. In other instances, it's business competition, financial conflict of interest, companies wanting to dominate, to corner the market. In other instances, it's basically just a power play by interests that have positioned themselves to be as pro openness, pro transparency, pro open society, but who actually have invested in spyware themselves and who actually want to be controlling society, but by claiming that they're pro transparency. So it's all very complicated, but it has very anti-Semitic undertones. They have singled out specifically Israeli spyware. You will not hear them discussing American spyware, which is very, very diverse and high quality, and in some cases, better suited for certain purposes than Pegasus. Then you won't hear them about talking about China or anything else. It's the focus of all these campaigns is entirely on Israeli companies, not just NSO Group, but a number of others, such as the Jorge campaign. There's also an attack on a software called Predator, which was used allegedly in Greece. And if you trace back at who is getting attacked, you will be sure to find that the owners of whatever software is in the news is always Israeli.
It's amazing. And let me ask you this. One of my listeners recently asked me about the Team Jorge details. It's a relatively new story, although it was developed by Forbidden Stories. That's how I'm familiar with the name. Forbidden Stories developed this, and in conjunction with Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, right?
Yes, let me explain who that organization is. That organization claims to be anti-Putin, anti-Russia. They've made a number of revelations about Putin's cryptocurrency funding of separatists in Spain. These are the same separatists, by the way, who are accusing Spanish government of using Pegasus to spy on them. There's lots of conflicts of interest there. For instance, the same group of interests who are now going after Pegasus in the past went after an older spyware from Germany called Finn Fisher. But when their Catalan allies purchased Finn Fisher, they actually tried to defend them for using Finn Fisher. So I bet you if Catalans had purchased Pegasus and used Pegasus themselves, nobody would have had a problem with them using Pegasus. It is only when the Spanish government that is defending its national sovereignty interests that they use the attacks to attack it. And there's a lot more going on geopolitically. I can give you other examples of how intelligence agencies are at play here, but I want to get back to OCCRP. So they position themselves to be an investigative body, anti-corruption body. If you look at them, they frequently cross-pollinate their staffers with another organization called Bellingcat and a couple of other organizations. One of them tracks to Soros, another one, I don't know who exactly, called Global Voices, leftist media group. Bellingcat also claims to be a group that took down a number of FSB and GRU activities in Europe, especially in London. And people have always thought that they're associated with Putin's opposition, Navalny. Because similar group people are in play. But if you actually look at the trajectory of these instigations and what's actually going on, it's much more likely that some oligarch or some militia leader like Prigozhin, who has had an increasingly aggressive back and forth with the Russian security services and who is basically trying to pull blanket in his own direction, is behind these organizations because they are actually working in conjunction with the pro-Pegasus people, and it makes no sense. On the one hand, they seem to be making these revelations about Russians, but on the other hand, they are attacking the software Spain, which has been going against Russians and investigating Russian activities. So what's really going on? What's going on is that they're not actually against Russian activities in Spain or anywhere else. They just want to be the ones. Whoever is behind these groups wants to be the one doing them. So whoever is pushing this campaign through these organizations has, for instance, accused Russians of lying to the Catalans, of underpaying them, promising X amount of money, but not being able to come up with that full number. So this is very clearly
Same old story.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is not about human rights. This is not any legitimate liberal opposition. This is a power struggle among Russian factions with their allies who've joined ranks, but who are also trying to pursue the same agenda as the Kremlin, but through their own means. And by co-opting these NGOs or creating these and funding these NGOs specifically for that purpose, to make themselves appear, gain international support for their own agenda, but also the same bad agenda that the Kremlin has to begin with.
When I had this information, I watched a couple of videos on Team Jorge, which is this Israeli outfit led by Hanan brothers. One of them is Tal, the other one I don't remember the name of. And it looked to me like a very amateurish kind of front video setup for something that wouldn't be so accessible in such manner. Very elementary presentations that they allegedly show to the clients, and it's kind of more of a, when you watch something done by Project Veritas, for example, here in the United States, it bears more veracity. It shows more kind of this situation based camera angles. Say this is like they were holding the cameras right in front of the objects, which are their objects, which I I don't think is possible. And so, what's the opinion right now about this relatively new sensationalist story rather, about this Israeli outfit that is purported to provide services for to the tune of, I think, $5-6 million per project to badmouth the opposition, as they are commissioned to by countries like Kenya. Elections in Kenya, they say, affected this. Is there any more details than one can find on the forbidden stories or on this OCCRP website? Have you
There's
followed any of it?
there's none because they're the ones who created this controversy for very specific reason. Kenya, several other African countries are important allies both to the United States and to Israel. Growing, they have a growing startup culture. They're developing rapidly, and some of them have also taken an anti-Chinese and anti-Russian turn as well. But in addition to all of that, they have significant natural resources. Rwanda, for instance, has a huge deposits of methane, but in addition to that, it has the so-called three keys, not rare earth elements that are very much needed for various technologies around the world, but that are plentiful in Africa, but there's very little of them elsewhere. So all of this is actually not so much about about the Israelis or the spyware or the opposition, because frankly, yes, we all know that there is corruption in African countries, and all sides are not, you know, saints. Saints. Let's just let's just be honest with ourselves. But this is about geopolitical play for who controls the market for natural resources in African countries, and quite simply, any Israeli that is interacting with particular governments gets in the way of the interest who opposes them and who wants to have control over those natural resources. It's very simple.
I was really to hear the name Bellingcat, which was very instrumental, from what I know, in the forming the opinion and basically claiming that it was Putin's order to destroy this Malaysian aircraft
Mhm.
over Ukraine, and that's interesting. How they work both ways, sort of. That would be
There's
very Sorosian because he tries to destroy everything.
they're basically trying to position themselves as the power player. If you look at their past work, for instance, during the 2020 war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, they actually fabricated reports claiming about literally fabricating attacks by alleged by Azerbaijan on Armenia, which simply did not take place, and nobody seems to remember that because there's nothing to remember. There was no investigation because those attacks did not happen. But the fact that they were fake reports is telling you that this party that's supposed to protect human rights was, instead of focusing on whatever was actually going on, was literally inventing stories. Another instance is that in the Mediterranean. Greece has had long-term issues with Bellingcat over various matters, and Greece is a democratic country member of the European Union. So this is clearly not about human rights and not just about Russia. Austria, another democratic European country that no one has ever accused of falsifying elections or anything, or being abusive towards its population in recent years, also had been attacked by Bellingcat again for similarly agenda-driven issues. So if you look at the pattern of it, yes, they leak information that proves to be accurate, but just because something is factual doesn't mean that there isn't an agenda behind it.
It's interesting how this Tol Hanan, leader of chief of this, the boss of this outfit, uh, Team Jorge, says, we will not be working against Israel ever. We won't do anything with American politics ever, and we will never work against Putin. That's what he says in as per the reports about his. I don't remember if it's on video or in his words, although who knows, with today's level of artificial intelligence. This is three markers that he's set around his work, and it's interesting the choice of it. And my next thought was, why those journalistic organizations are they really doing anything about cleaning the air over American elections in 2020 or 2022? Are they interested? Because I see a lot of interesting headlines here regarding Russia, regarding this and that, but nothing about Hunter Biden stories with their abilities that would be able. I mean, I don't know what is missing. From what
Well,
I saw, we have more than we can digest.
these
But
organizations actually work very closely with the Biden administration. Uh, Openly, this is not a secret. So they're not going to investigate somebody they're working with, obviously. In terms of Tal's comments, I would be very surprised that if any businessman, even if he felt he had a great relationship with any particular leader outside his own country and maybe their number one ally, would actually go on record and say, I will never go against Putin. Why would anyone say that, even if mentally they felt that to be the case? You don't want to leave it to chance. And first of all, you don't want to be caught in that political situation. You don't want to be cornered, and you also don't want to rule out what happens if you have to. What happens if you are hired by a government to do your job, and it happens to conflict with that? You know, unless you have a Russian citizenship and you cannot, and you consider it your country, chances are there is always a possibility that you may have to do something that does not align with those interests, especially if, for instance, uh, you know, uh, there is a conflict between not doing something against Israel and the United States and not doing something against Putin. There could be that potential conflict, for instance. So he, in that position, would be stuck. That's why I don't think any businessman would actually go on record and actually say something like that to anyone under any circumstances. It just is not smart.
A question that came to my mind now: George Soros is not getting younger himself, and with the news that Jimmy Carter just had been admitted to hospice, and with George Soros's demise, which will happen sooner or later, uh, how this organization would continue to affect the situation worldwide was relatively small but very craftily used resources.
Well, George Soros has a young and active son who is now serving on all the boards. He's only about 40 years old, and given his father's age, he's probably going to if nothing happens, last as long as he does, if not longer. And I don't know if he has a family or not, but it's become clearly a family enterprise. But let's forget about Soros personally. It's an institution. An institution is an ideology, it's a methodology, and it's resources, and therefore it's greater than any one particular man and his lifespan. So we have an entire mindset that has been cultivated for decades, and they've raised generations of activists um, and various sub institutions who are all fairly invested in it. It's going to continue with or without Soros.
It's a thought for me, and I'm thinking that Russia, Putin's Russia, has this story of banning Soros's funded organizations in Russia, but basically they picked up the MO. Soros to me is someone who's sitting in on the arena, and he's enjoying the jousting parties on this arena, fighting with each other, while he's picking pockets of the unsuspecting public. And Russia is pretty much doing the same, allowing oligarch fund this or that group in Europe, using it as a place was like a ring where they would have their bouts, where they have their battles among with each other, while Russia is reaping benefits, of course, not as effectively as does George Soros, but also because also doing it with great benefit to itself, because they say that Russia. I don't think that Russian oligarchs got much poorer after the war began in Ukraine, but the country lost 35% of their revenue altogether, and according to the Western way of bookkeeping, they're in nothing but trouble. But they still not talking about ending violence or somehow going towards any solution to this war in Ukraine, which is a disgrace. Anything on the Ukraine on your behalf of what you see today from your point of view? Any Ukrainian news? Because a lot of people from Ukraine are watching this program as well.
Well, in terms of ending the war, the reason why it's not happening is several-fold. First of all, while the sanctions have been effective in undermining certain sectors of Russian economy, Russia they haven't been fully implemented. First of all, they haven't been fully enforced, and they definitely haven't been as broad as they could be. For instance, Biden talked about banning various raw materials coming from Russia, very aluminum would be a huge blow to the Russian economy if US stopped using it altogether. Russia is one of the top producers of that material and related matters, but so far that has not happened. So there's a lot more that can be done. Second, Russia is working with non-Western countries, the first in line being China, but there's also Iran, to a lesser extent India, the Gulf states, and of course African and Latin American countries. None of them are on board with the sanctions. None of them are participating in the sanctions regime. So long as most of the world is not actually involved, these sanctions are naturally limited. They're not as Russia is not fully isolated at all. The third issue is don't underestimate the activities of militias in supplementing the economy through shadow activities, which primarily consist of smuggling operations. In Africa, Wagner is smuggling gold in vast quantities that no one can keep track of. Most of it disappears. Where does gold from Africa usually go? Gulf states, India, and several other well-known locations around the world, Hong Kong, one of them being. So long as they have that as a source of income, even if their official economy collapses, they still have a source of revenue to continue the activities that they do choose to support. And quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't later reorganize and find a second breath through these smuggling activities. Now, to be clear, Prigozhin and some of these militia leaders are not in favor of continuing the war in Ukraine because so much damage has been done so early and the military has been so poorly prepared that they don't believe it's possible, that particular battle is possible to salvage. However, that doesn't mean that they're going away. They find it much more lucrative to look forward to continuation of business as usual, dividing up Russia's natural resources, pursuing their agendas in Africa, all over Europe, and continuing with these games. They basically have written off Ukraine as a cost of doing business. Unfortunate that it was expensive, but definitely not fatal to their own operations. So, as individual entities and groups, they are looking forward to a very, very fruitful and beneficial future because they actually see more room to exploit various openings and vulnerabilities than even before the war.
Yeah, using the model of Victor Bout, which was not like the only hero of Putin's Russia. There's plenty of people, hundreds of people like Victor Bout, who was recently exchanged for Brittany Griner, the basketball player. But the last name Deripaska is not the hardest to pronounce Russian surnames, but the name Deripaska is synonymous with Russian aluminum. He is the king of aluminum. So Deripaska is related to his friends of Frank McGonigal, who recently entered also the system of American um, information that deals with the reality of the situation. Let's call it this way. And also, it's he's a friend of or close to someone whose last name is also Hunter Biden. So that's where the liberties come for the so some wiggle room comes rather to for the Russian aluminum. Deripaska is the person who's in charge of Russian aluminum. Irina, what would be? I wanted to ask you a question. Um, what we have not covered yet, the story that the Arab countries, Arab programs, we touched upon the Qatari attacks against you, right?
Well, there's a more to the story because Qatar's business with Russia is substantially closer than meets the eye. Unlike many other Arab countries who've been making a lot of noise and UAE, there's a lot of Russian money being laundered through there. But in terms of actual business operations, Qatar is the number one ally of Russia in the Arab world. First of all, they're part of a gas cartel that controls over 60% of natural gas since 2008, along with Iran. So that alone makes Qatar a major beneficiary of the war in Ukraine, not just because of high prices, but because it's a cartel. They coordinate all their activities. Second issue, Russia's playbook is used in all Qatar's lobbying and political operations. For instance, I found a trail going through Albania where both Russia and Qatar were using to fund their agents in the United States, and they were both coordinating their efforts to lobby the Trump campaign and later the Trump administration simultaneously. And whoever they hired in the US, those people were getting paid through similar channels, and none of it is coincidental. Most interestingly is that the Gulf crisis of 2017 that came off to benefit Qatar against other Arab countries had a Russian trail in it. The Russian hackers were responsible for what appeared to be a false flag operation blaming UAE for a hack of a news agency. Completely ridiculous, by the way, for very obvious reasons. And nearly brought these countries to the brink of a physical combat. And guess what happened to those Russian hackers? Nobody knows who they are because guess what? The New York counterterrorism point person on all of this at that time was the very same McGonigal. So he would have been dealing with both the Qatar investigation and the Russian angle of it. So there's much more to investigate with him than just the campaign related um, um information that we know of, or for that matter, his personal dealings in Albania.
Yeah, it would take at least 7 Le Carres to untangle the story. Irina, it's a pleasure, an honor to have you, such a courageous person as you are, on this program, and I must promise that we will do same thing in Russian to those who need more details to get a better picture in Russian, both wherever Russian language is spoken, in the United States, Canada, Australia. We have Russian listeners from all over the world, not the least from Russia and the Ukraine, of course. Irina, thank you so very much, and have a
Absolutely.
safe trip home.
Thank you so much.